Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi bismillahir rahmanir rahim, and welcome to our 39th episode of Islamicate book reviews with myself, Osama al-Azami, and my colleague, Dr. Omar Anchassi at the University of Bern, which I just realized I should have on the screen as well, like
there
so. Welcome to everyone, and inshallah this week we're going to be discussing Youshaa Patel's book, which has a remarkably long sort of subtitle. The book is entitled The Muslim Difference. The subtitle is Defining the Line Between Believers and Unbelievers from Early Islam to the Present. Nice, long, descriptive subtitle. Not rhyming, alhamdulillah. Well,
I like titles that tell you what the book is doing.
Absolutely.
Full marks for that one.
And without further ado, just the format is the usual. I will sort of hand over to Omar. He will talk about the book for about 25 minutes perhaps, and then we'll go into a discussion. As ever, audience members are welcome to put in their comments and their questions, and we will try and address these in the second half of the discussion. But without further ado, Omar, I'd like to hand over to you, inshallah.
Thank you, Osama. We had, you and I made some initial remarks about the book in the final minutes of last week's episode, so I won't detain viewers by repeating those, and they're very welcome to revisit the last few minutes of that episode. As I said, it's based on a 2012 Duke University PhD thesis that I remember reading shortly after meeting the author, I think in 2015 in Edinburgh, the inaugural Brace conference. And I remember being deeply impressed by the thesis, and no doubt it had all kinds of bearings on my subsequent scholarly development that kind of, I'm sure, will become clearer with time. But anyway, this book is a study, among many other things, of the concept and the history of tashabbuh, or imitation. The word being a form 5 verb that also has kind of connotations of assimilation and emulation and resemblance and these kinds of things. And it is comprised of a preface, introduction, 8 body chapters of varying length, and a very interesting and in many ways important epilogue, which really functions more like an additional body chapter than a conclusion that just restates some of the main findings of the book. Actually, the author embarks on new claims and so on, and that's interesting, and we'll definitely attend to that further on in the episode. The first, or the preface, kind of frames some of the main issues, just to give you a very brief overview of the book's contents. The first chapter is, there's an introduction, and the first chapter is concerned with turning away from the Jews and Christians, and discusses issues like the Qibla and certain differences, embodied differences Muslims cultivated to symbolize their distinctiveness from particularly Jews and Christians, Kitabis. And more broadly, the book tries to reinsert into the history of Islam the body that mediates this kind of experience of tashabbuh and symbolizes, through quotidian practices like certain forms of grooming and dress and so on, that may be small in size, relatively speaking, but very significant in value. So the first chapter is concerned with that. The second chapter is really a tracing of the key Hadith reports on the subject. Unlike Goldziher and Kister, Youshaa Patel finds that the term tashabbuh did not always have negative or exclusively negative resonances, but rather it shifted, as in early sources like the Kitab al-Ain, the first dictionary of the Arabic language, from a fairly neutral or multivalent set of connotations to one that became increasingly negative. He says that by the 11th century, there was more or less a consensus on the understanding that tashabbuh is a bad thing, although from about the 10th century onwards at least, Sufis did emphasize the bipolar nature of tashabbuh, the fact that it had good as well as bad aspects. One could avoid emulating the wicked and sinful and non-Muslim and so on, and equally one could cultivate resemblance to the prophets and the Salihin and so on. So that's chapter 2, and I know last week I complained about the lack of isnad diagrams. This book has 2 lovely isnad diagrams that I will discuss in more detail. Chapter 3 concerns the empire of small differences. I think this chapter foregrounds one of the key points in the book that's taken up, in some sense, in every chapter of the book in various ways, and particularly in the epilogue, this notion of an imperial imaginary, what the author terms, and I'll refer to him as Youshaa since I do know him personally, an imperial imaginary, this kind of grammar of alterity that is deeply structured and inflected by a kind of concepts of hierarchy that span a range of binary opposites, whether it's Muslim, non-Muslim, man, woman, free, slave, Arab, non-Arab, and so on, even Bedouin and Hadar, settled and so on, which, it does feature occasionally in the book, and so on. Then chapter 4 discusses the sort of symbolism of these Muslim differences. Chapter 5 is immediately preceding chapter 6. Chapter 6 is focused on Ibn Taymiyyah's اقتداء الصراط المستقيم مخالفة أصحاب الجحيم. Chapter 7 is on Najm al-Din al-Ghazi's حسن التنبه لما ورد في التشبه and other things. I mean, he also looks at Ghazi's discussion of coffee and so on, and the 17th century Ottoman context more generally. That's it. Chapter 5.
It's on Ibn Taymiyyah.
Chapter 5 is the Ibn Taymiyyah chapter, sorry. Chapter 6 is a small chapter that I don't believe appeared on the thesis, basically on Sufi tashabbuh, talking about authors like Ghazali and so on, but especially Abu Najib al-Suhrawardi and his nephew Shihab ad-Din, not to be confused with the famous Suhrawardi who was executed for his Zandakha, reportedly. So 5 Ibn Taymiyyah, 6 brief chapter on Sufi ideas about tashabbuh, and then 7 kind of building on that. Najm al-Din al-Ghazi's 12-volume work. I'll obviously have to discuss in more detail. And then finally the final body chapter, it seems, is the one on the wearing of European hats, which was also not present in the original thesis. Of course, we discussed this issue, the Transvaal Fatwa, which features prominently there in the episode we did on Oliver Sharbrought's book, and also the Hat Law of 1925 and so on. We discussed at length in the episode we did on Sevki Adat's book. So I probably won't talk about that chapter very much, although he does mention some interesting new sources. In 1862, a Tunisian student of the applied sciences resident in France wrote an interesting work called not Hidayat al-Hayara, Ajwibat al-Hayara fi Qalansuwat al-Nasara, on the wearing of brimmed European hats. And fellow students of his had expressed concern that by wearing European brimmed hats, as we know from the episode on Sevki Adek's book, a major controversy in the early 20th century, that they would have to repeat their shahadas and remarry their wives back home and so on. And this 1862 work, which is very, I wonder if it's the earliest work to address this question of European hats in the context of tashabbuh. He reassured them that it wasn't problematic and so on, kind of similar to the lines Abda would adopt later. He was, however, heavily criticized by Muhammad Alish, and Patel, or Youshaa tells us this is the correct pronunciation, and Alish and other pronunciations are a mistake. And Alish said the things that have often been used to argue against this position, including the view that brimmed hats stop one from making sujood correctly in prayer. The idea being that you're kind of not supposed to remove your hat. It's very aib, I guess, to uncover your head in public, and it would probably destroy your muru'ah and your kind of probity and ability to serve as a witness and all of this other stuff, to lead prayer and so on. Anyway, and also he discusses in that final 8th body chapter the controversy between Abdus Tun and Mufti of Egypt, Abdul Majid Salim, and the criticism of his fatwa by Al-Kawthari also on this subject of dress and tashabbuh and so on. The final chapter, Osama, or the epilogue rather, I know you'll want to discuss when we get to it, but not yet, I urge you, is titled something like "Seeing the Other in the Light of God," which perhaps unintentionally recalls Reza Shah Kazemi's book titled "The Other in Light of the One," or something like this, on Muslim-Buddhist dialogue. Reza Shah Kazemi being the muqaddam of Sayyid Hussein Nasr and the kind of chief Maryami in the UK and so on. So you can see where that's coming from. But anyway, Patel basically pushes back in a concerted and sustained way, and not entirely, not unsophisticated way, of course. I have great respect for Dr. Patel's intellect and learning and just personality. He's a lovely person, mashallah. Against what he had termed earlier, as I referred to it, this imperial, what was it I said? Imperial imaginary. And he says, the ethic endorsed by Ibn Taymiyyah in Iqtida Sirat al-Mustaqim, whereby he famously says, this kind of often discussed in Muslim circles since the 90s and so on, that if Muslims living among non-Muslims, for the sake of maslaha diniyah, it may actually be preferable for them not to distinguish themselves overtly in physical ways, to dress as non-Muslims dress and so on. He says this kind of language of maslaha and so on is ethically thin. So this is a critique. And he urges Muslims in non-Muslim majority context to cultivate what he terms social citizenship. Now, it's an interesting chapter full of fascinating claims. I have to say it's the chapter I found least compelling in the book. He anticipates a number of criticisms, which suggests to me he's not unaware that he may get some pushback, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to push back a bit on that chapter. Just briefly before returning to discuss the chapters in greater detail and then eventually turning to you for further discussion, Osama. For example, he says the partisans of Hadith, Ahl al-Hadith, kind of read scriptural texts and imposed this imperial imaginary on them in ways that were extrinsic to the text. Now, even based on his presentation, so in other words, they kind of valorized hierarchy, and especially in the context of Muslim-non-Muslim relations. Now, even based on his presentation in these texts on tashabbuh, particularly in chapter 2, where he discusses the hadith and the asanid at great length with great dexterity, even based on his presentation of the text, this claim is, to me, straightforwardly incorrect. Yes, certainly there was a certain amount of projection going on, no doubt about it. And this ethos undoubtedly guided pre-modern jurists who did not valorize equality in the way that some moderns do, guided their reading of the text, no doubt. But insofar as language has any meaning at all, this ethos is undoubtedly present in the text itself. In chapter 2, so I'll probably start mixing discussion of the chapters now and drawing freely on one to kind of highlight points in another. In chapter 2, for example, he tells us there are two kind of main versions of the tashabbuh hadith. One is the concise version, man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum, which is found among the Sihah al-Sitta only in Abu Dawud Sunan. Of course, it's found in many other collections. And Abu Dawud, he argues, actually kind of canonizes this as a separate statement, although it's found as a separate statement already in Musannaf Abd al-Razzaq. He says, the longer version of the hadith is an apocalyptic version of the hadith found prominently in Musnad Ahmad, also many other collections. I mean, you find this hadith against Tashabbuh in various iterations, everywhere from Dhamm al-Kalam of al-Harawi to Musnad Abi Ya'la. I mean, he says by the 8th century, it's found basically in every Muslim center. So what is, and he argues, by the way, Abu Dawud freely acknowledges elsewhere that he will often truncate hadith to emphasize a certain point. Based on a study of the variants, Youshaa tells us that the full version of this hadith is the apocalyptic one. So Abu Dawud is excerpting this phrase from the broader context of the hadith, which is the famous hadith, which features in ISIS publications that I worked on. بعثت بالسيف قال صلى الله عليه وسلم بعثت بالسيف بين يدي الساعة حتى يعبد الله وحده لا شريك له, etc. And then the phrase about my rizq being in the shade of my spear. And what is it? أذل والصغار على من خالف أمري, and so on. And then the very final phrase in the hadith, ومن تشبه بقوم فهو منهم. So, I mean, it's very difficult to argue because Youshaa himself is telling us this phrase is excerpted from a longer hadith. It's, I think, inconceivable to argue that, hierarchy is not coded into the DNA of this, Dhul and Saghar, right? I mean, how more hierarchical do you want to get? I mean, then not, it doesn't take a great deal of intelligence to say, what is it? And leaving, Shurut Omar and Omar's Pact, which we discussed in last week's episode, features a lot in this book. And okay, as the jurists acknowledge, yes, this is a post-prophetic development, and we discussed its attribution in the last episode, so I probably won't go into more detail on that. Although Albrecht Noth emphasizes to a greater extent, Youshaa tells us, than Milka Levy Rubin and Mark Cohen, its kind of indigenous origins, if you like. Anyway, ignoring the Pact of Omar, or bracketing that question for a moment, which is obviously full of this kind of symbolism of hierarchy, what about the jizya and the saghar mandated in the Quran 9:129? I mean, what is your notion of scriptural texts? If it's the Quran, then I can point to many verses that embody the same ethic, particularly revealed, later on in the Prophet's life, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If it's the hadith, then I don't even know where to begin. I mean, the fact that, as we discussed at length in our episode on Johann Friedman's wonderful book, The Discussion of the Return of Isa alayhi salam, which, as he says, a number of modern hadith critics regarded as mutawatir, and without endorsing that claim or rejecting it, I mean, one encounters the notion that jizya is something that is abolished in apocalyptic time, at the eschaton. And presumably, if one takes those apocalyptic hadith seriously as feature in a number of Sunni creeds, Dr. Friedman tells us, then the jizya is something that remains until apocalyptic time and until it's abolished. It's not the prerogative of jurists to do so, certainly. So the claim that this imperial imaginary is extrinsic to the text, I think, is self-evidently false, even based on Dr. Youshaa's presentation of the sources. So anyway, to return to chapter 1, turning aside from the Jews. I mean, the book is interesting because it begins with Muhammad Asad and ends with Muhammad Asad, his 1933 Islam at the Crossroads in the introduction, which really emphasizes and valorizes this notion of cultivating a sense of difference and self-pride, and that kind of aping the West will lead to no good, effectively. And then in the final chapter, the epilogue, he discusses in 1980, I think in one place he says the 1981 edition of the book, and then he says in 1980 in the epilogue, if I'm not mistaken. So, but it's early 1980s in any case. this idea that actually Assad has, and he characterizes it as a dramatic reversal. I'm not entirely convinced it is, but anyway, the idea that, well, Muslims actually aren't different and we're all human beings and all this. So the idea that Assad kind of changed his position, and this is a kind of springboard for Dr. Youshaa to kind of reflect on, if you like, subverting this hierarchy of difference based on commonly shared, commitments today to moral egalitarian attitudes, basically. We've said in many episodes, you and I, Usama, and I remember in the discussion on Junaid Qadri's book, in that episode, this whole discussion, it's really foregrounded in Dr. Junaid's book, that Muslims live in a world not of their own making. But I submit that there is a great difference between valorizing this fact and internalizing it and making it normative, and another attitude, which is making the best of a bad situation. And I would argue that Dr. Youshaa, I think you would acknowledge, explicitly does the first. And my approach is somewhat different. I don't want to talk about my approach. I haven't theorized this with the same sophistication and rigor as Dr. Youshaa. But I think,
You tend not to speak in normative terms, Omar, like a good historian.
Yeah, but of course it's impossible when discussing the epilogue, that's the thing, the epilogue is a normative intervention. It wasn't present in the thesis, and actually the book would have been perfectly complete without it. I think some of his readers urged him to kind of add these additional reflections, but really the book is an outstanding, and I love the book, and I love the author, Dr. Youshaa. The book would have been perfectly complete without this normative intervention. Then, your typical conclusion will just restate some of your main findings and maybe add some fun primary sources and quotations and a nice, striking theme or discussion to conclude on. But no, this this epilogue really ups the ante, as it were. And
but
if I could say, because I have a few minutes, if I could just say, it's not an attack. I'm not attacking. I'm disagreeing. But so, for example, I wonder if some of the problems, everyone is aware of these issues Dr. Youshaa presents could not be dealt with in other ways. I feel like, because, as I said, I think this imperial imaginary is really not extrinsic to the text to a great extent, and I've given some very basic examples. I think a lot of the problems he addresses could be dealt with and were dealt with in other ways. For example, this problem he says, for example, cultivating, this kind of positive ethic of embracing the other and so on, is actually kind of good ta'deeb, and erasing hierarchy is a kind of good ta'deeb, and it's a good form of self-cultivation and of humility, But there are other ways to do this, even, so in hierarchical contexts like Birgavi, and I think he's channeling Ghazali, but I'd have to check the Ihya. Birgavi says, in a context where this hierarchy matters, when you see a dhimmi on the street, what should your natural reaction be? When you see anyone on the street, but he gives the example of a dhimmi among others. Basically, anyone you encounter in the street, you should imagine them to be better than yourself. How does he explain this? He says, for example, only God knows whether the dhimmi you encounter will not, convert to Islam and become better than you. So there are ways of dealing with, the arrogance that hierarchy might induce that do not involve subverting the hierarchical principle, as Dr. Youshaa does. One could give other examples. I think a lot of the anxiety he expresses about life in the West and so on, I don't completely buy, because I honestly think an ethic of good neighborliness that does not subvert the hierarchical distinctions in the same way is perfectly in accordance with even the most rigorous or conservative vision of the Sharia. And this, I forget who it was, Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak, who had a Jewish neighbor, or maybe Ahmed, I forget whom, and he wanted to sell his house for a certain amount. I'm really messing up this anecdote, but I'd have to look it up to confirm. But the gist is there, So this ethos was expressed in pre-modern, very hierarchical context. Let's say the Jewish neighbor wanted to sell the house for 1,000 dirhams or something, and he said, 100 for the house, 900 for the neighbor. Adar qabla dar and all of this,
I think it was
And-
Abdullah ibn Mubarak who was the name.
Abdullah ibn
And the
al-Mubarak.
Jewish-
Yeah, so
the Jewish chap-
I mean the amounts of money I've messed up, but you understand the point I'm making, and the ethic of good neighborliness again does not subvert this distinction. At the same time, the rights of how great are the rights of the neighbor? The Prophet ﷺ reportedly said, I thought that the neighbor would be made an inheritor. Now, obviously we both live alongside non-Muslims and work alongside them. Although in Osama and in the UK, you're in that fortress of Islam. I mean, the people, based on the census data, people should be making hijrah to London and Birmingham. Anyway, this is a sort of intro. I mean, I think in previous episodes I referred to this point that London has more masajid.
Islam.
London, according to any definition,
Muslim ruler.
I mean, before he was made to resign or kicked out, he was referred to quite racistly as the Sultan.
Yeah, absolutely.
As the Sultan. Actually, I'm glad they restored Mayor Lutfur Rahman. Firstly, because I think he's actually doing a great deal for the residents.
We restored him through our votes. What are you talking
and
about?
by the way, I mean, this raises other issues like the kind of implied by the epilogue, because Dr. Youshaa talks about social citizenship. I mean, I think if you look at Muslims' participation in national politics in the US and UK, it's basically been a failure, and almost an unmitigated failure. I would actually say the area where Muslims can and should shine is local politics. I really think, at the council level, for example, and mayorships and so, because at the national level, I mean, you look at the voting, and this is going to be deeply personal, this episode, in the same way that Youshaa says in the foreword or preface to his book, he cannot disentangle, the issues in the book, in some way inspired by this 2002 khutbah he attended on Tashabbuh that kind of started him thinking about this process. I mean, obviously it's deeply personal, and actually
20-year journey.
Yeah, actually that inspires the book. Anyway, and that really makes the book interesting, and it's very well done. So congratulations. And obviously I like the book. I mean, I really hope that's already obvious to viewers, even though I may disagree with elements here or there. So where was I? Yeah, so this thing about social citizenship, I mean, most Muslim MPs, speaking of the UK context, have terrible voting records. I mean, and these are the same people, by the way, who will go, every 5 years in the time of general elections, cap in hand to their Muslim constituents, and they'll pull out the Muslim card and expect to be elected. I mean, I would much rather have some good old lefty backbencher representing me in parliament than, I mean, some of these Muslim MPs, without naming names, not all of them, but some of them real scumbags. I mean, in all kinds of ways. Now, the problem is, because they are Muslims, they have to kind of perform in certain ways, and they have to, and often, not always, but often, I mean, there are such pressures exerted on them, not to mention the fact that, I mean, a lot of them go in with the wrong intention in the first place, right? I mean, they're careerist, I mean, all kinds of criticisms could be made, but I don't want to stray too far from the themes of the book. But I think hopefully I've given a basic introduction. I will return to discuss the chapters, and this will be a slightly longer episode, as we've discussed, Osama.
Inshallah. So I just wanted to say on the last point you mentioned. I mean, I had the privilege of presenting a report. I actually might have it in hand. Presenting a report that I'd authored at Parliament scarcely a month ago. So,
what was it? Who convened this? The all Muslim Party.
This was the All Party Parliamentary Group. APPG, the All Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims, in partnership with a Muslim charity, and I met with some Muslim MPs, and the ones I know are, I think, in many ways, remarkably exemplary. But,
I mean, I wouldn't wish to deny that anyways.
We all know the people you're talking about, so it's quite all right. So what I would also say, I was just going to say in defense of, in defense of Youshaa, just the point that you were making, because I said, oh, you're making a normative intervention. Like a good historian, you don't usually do that. And I think that's one of our problems in Islamic studies, that we're all expected to be these sort of good secular historians, not political theorists or theologians or philosophers. And I think normative interventions are what we should be engaged in if we, so in that regard, I think the sort of work that Youshaa is doing is exemplary. I think it's problematic when it's being done under certain types of problematic normative pressures, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't in any way suggest
that would be very eloquent in sort of
I mean,
contesting maybe our characterization of some of his. But
no, I wouldn't.
But yeah,
I wouldn't. I actually, both of us, and I'm sure it's very clear, would never kind of suggest that Youshaa is some kind of flake. I mean, that's ridiculous. He's a man of great integrity, and I respect him far more than myself. I mean, and actually, I think his next project, if I understood correctly from something I read recently, will be more kind of interested in entering this normative space. And actually, I would encourage him, notwithstanding my disagreements with some elements of the epilogue, I would encourage him to continue to do this. Not that he needs my encouragement, of course. But, we have so few people doing it, and, even fewer people doing it well. I mean, the examples that come to mind are people like, Martin Wynne, who read the complete draft of this book, Sherman Jackson, Ramon Harvey. I'm thinking of the younger generation now, but certainly Dr. Jackson. Ramon, Martin, Youshaa is doing it very well. I would definitely encourage people to continue this, because it's a very important conversation to have. As I said in the previous space, the science of Judaism, as it is Judaic studies, was kind of first embarked on in the 19th century by people who were themselves Jewish. And as Muslims, we've kind of come to participate in a discipline that we did not form. But nonetheless, for demographic and other reasons, if you like, imperial blowback, we are here because you were there. Muslims are now participating.
These are frank conversations I've had with sort of people over the years. It's really fascinating. People are sometimes in polite society in which we reside, people never say, go back to where you came from. But there will be moments when that sentiment kind of will leak through other statements. And, my tendency in those sorts of circumstances is to sometimes, if the moment calls for it, say quite frankly, look, why the hell do you think I'm here in the first place, right? I wish I was where I came from.
But I'm the British are very directly responsible for what happened to my extended family.
Yes. I'm here because my grandfather was born in British India, for God's sake.
But
anyway,
sorry. Maybe I can say something quickly about, and it's a really great book. Definitely it should be read, definitely should be translated into Arabic.
Yeah.
Maybe, I'm not sure about that book, but generally it should be translated into Arabic. Not to say that the basic idea hasn't been expressed elsewhere.
Give him bad attention if he translates the
epilogue. It might be misunderstood.
Get a book like this translated without.
But it's a wonderful book. the thesis was wonderful, and the book certainly builds on it. So, chapter I said 7 on Ibn Taymiyyah. 6 on Ibn Taymiyyah.
Yeah.
No, sorry. 8 is on hats. 7 is on Najmuddin al-Ghazi.
5 is on Ibn Taymiyyah.
6 is on the Sufi Tashabbuh, 5 is on Ibn Taymiyyah. Great. Iqtida' Sirat al-Mustaqim, he calls the first and the most influential treatise on Tashabbuh. Ibn Taymiyyah is a very dexterous thinker, he says, and resists actually categorical opposition. So Muslims always the Ummatun Wasata. It's not like Muslims versus X. He always positions Muslims in the center. So, for example, in the same way, the Jews kind of sequester, or rabbinic Jews sort of sequester, or at least sleep separately from menstruating wives, whereas Christians do not entertain religious notions of tahara and najasa at all. In that respect, Islam is sort of in the middle, so on and so forth. That very briefly,
Go ahead, please.
Yeah,
I'll leave that question.
I mean, the context of Ibn Taymiyyah is one fraught with all kinds of anxieties about imitation and border crossing, physical and symbolic. The Mongols occupied Damascus briefly in 1300, and in 1301 the Mamluks reinforced the stipulations. He tells us in I think chapter 3 or maybe 4, chapter 4, that the Mamluks enforce. So it's blue turbans on Nasara, red on Samaritans, and yellow on Jews. There isn't necessarily, and the Ottomans, bar non-Muslims from wearing turbans entirely, interestingly. In another chapter, Ibn al-Qayyim disagrees with Abu al-Qasim al-Lalaka'i, the Shafi'i jurist and theologian, who kind of insists on the yellow color, and Ibn al-Qayyim actually says, no, there's no, this yellow is just a contingent thing, other colors can be used and so on. But in 1301, the Mamluks reiterate these shurut of dhimma and especially the sartorial norms. And in 1309, Ibn Taymiyyah literally begs al-Nasir, al-Malik al-Nasir Muhammad bin Qalawun, not to kind of rescind these stipulations which he is considering doing. And Ibn Taymiyyah expresses great anxiety about, particularly celebration of non-Muslim festivals, Maundy Thursday, and so on. And the kind of key point, I think, the key intervention Dr. Youshaa is making is that people kind of emphasize the bid'ah element of this work, and there's a long history going back, I think he says, to the 9th century of anti-bid'ah treatises. But they neglect the fact that tashabbuh is really at the center and is, alongside bid'ah, and these are closely tied together by Ibn Taymiyyah in this treatise. And this is a kind of he takes this fairly diffuse concept and really reworks it into a sophisticated discourse. Unsurprisingly, Ibn Taymiyyah is this great kind of original and synthetic think at the same time. And he argues that this is for him, tashabbuh is an entirely negative phenomenon, unlike Najmuddin al-Ghazi, who I will discuss. And, he says, tying it to Quranic notions of wala, I think it's Quran 551 perhaps, on wala of believers for each other and so on, and enmity to non-Muslims. So it has entirely negative connotations for him. And from the outset, he ties tashabbuh to bid'ah by saying, for example, that Omar bin Luhay, who famously introduced idolatry to the Kaaba, making it an idolatrous shrine, corrupting the monotheism, the Abrahamic monotheism, he says was guilty of tashabbuh of the Syrian idolaters. So you can see how there's a kind of these things reinforce one another. I want to say, I will let you speak, and then I should say something about chapter 2 and the kind of tracing of the hadith and its variants.
That's not a problem. I mean, I also, I'm happy to actually also point out that we do have a question from
all right.
An interestingly named, someone by the name of Watermelon786. So the question, and so I don't mind if we start off with a question,
sure.
And just want to, let the viewers know that we will try and address your questions throughout. But the question is, do Islamic scholars recognize a difference between the legal status of Islam in this world and the fate of people in the hereafter?
Yes, certainly. I mean, there's no doubt they do, because, even somebody who is treated in this world according to the ahkam of non-Muslims, may be excused for his lack of awareness about Islam, right. And nonetheless enters paradise, just to give one example. So certainly there is a distinction here. To say something about chapter 2, I've already said that this hadith in its longer apocalyptic version, explicitly hierarchical version is found in Musnad Ahmad, and the concise version is found in Abu Dawud's Sunan. Now, this hadith, interestingly, has basically a Damascene isnad. I mean, most of the reports go through Abdullah bin Umar, although we do find variants where they go through Omar. And Damascus, of course, is the city associated with the Pact of Omar, so that's interesting. But reportedly, Abdullah bin Umar brings it to Damascus. Now, there are many isnads for this traced in two wonderful diagrams. I'd love to know, actually, if you drew these diagrams or this software he recommends or something, because it's very well done. So the hadith,
and
there are kind
feel
of...
free to sort of send me the diagram and I would be able to hopefully share it on the screen or something.
The hadith has a Damascene isnad and eventually it becomes Iraqi, but the kind of core is Damascene. The people who are the primary circulators this term uses, as opposed to the common link. Primary circulator because, primary circulator does not suggest anything about their activities. It does not suggest they've fabricated it, which is what Shacht would say with, and Yonbal and so on with common links. So it's a neutral term. The primary circulators of this hadith are residents in kind of Damascus, al-Azami and Abdurrahman bin Thawban. And the hadith is not without defects, which I will discuss, and the kind of grading of various Muslim hadith critics. Both Abdurrahman bin Thawban, or bin Thawban, as I will call him, and al-Awza'i get the hadith from another Damascene, Hassan bin Atiyah, who gets it from another Damascene, Abu al-Munib al-Jurashi. Now, the hadith is not entirely without problems, such that Bukhari excerpts the phrase on, my rizq is under the shade of spears, and he uses this separately, which Ibn Hajar, he cites it in the section on jihad, which Ibn Hajar suggested he did not regard the hadith very highly in terms of its transmission. Ahmed also said
it's ta'liq.
It's a bab, so it's not a hadith kind of in content. It's a chapter title,
So it's not in Bukhari in the technical sense.
Yeah. So he kind of uses he's more lax with chapter headings in the material and chapter headings and section headings and so on than he is with actual content. Anyway, Dr. Youshaa also tells us Ahmed regarded the hadith as da'if. However, it's massive. It's transmitted in all kinds of isnads. So Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani say it is Hasan or Jayyid. Al-Hafidh al-Iraqi, Ibn Hibban and Al-Hakim say it is Sahih. Al-Albani says it's Hasan, but because of corroboration and so on, it's authentic in its meaning, and the isnad is Hasan, but the hadith is Sahih. Nuruddin later, rahimahullah, says, interestingly, uses the terminology Sahih li ghayrihi. Kawthari also thinks the isnad could be better, but because it's cited and practiced and it becomes a principle of Islam, it's kind of elevated by virtue of this status. So, the isnad is not entirely without problems. As I said, from Ibn Thawban, it passes, I think, immediately to Ahmed and via one intermediary to Abu Dawud, who was a student of Ahmed. And it's interesting to note the context where this appears in hadith works. In Abu Dawud, it's cited in the context of Libas al-Shuhra. And in Musannaf Abdul Razak, it is in the section on shaving one's nape, or rather not shaving one's nape, and zuhud. So this hadith where Omar, or this report where Omar, basically says somebody should not resemble the Majus in various ways. However, in many contexts, as is obvious from the full hadith, Bu'athu bisayf bani yadasa, etc. For example, Ibn al-Mubarak's Kitab al-Jihad, Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba, Sunan Sa'id bin Mansur, it's really in the context of jihad and chapters on jihad, as one would expect. And so on. So it's a really interesting hadith, and he argues that Abu Dawud, truncated it, and he has the same version of the hadith as Ahmed and so on. The longer apocalyptic, more kind of jihad-oriented hadith, but he wanted to emphasize a particular dimension of it. Anyway, I want to say something before turning to you, Osama. So I've jumped from the Ibn Taymiyyah chapter 5 to chapter 2, and I want to jump to, I think I've probably said about as much as I want to say on the final body chapter 8, because we've already discussed this question of sartorial norms and dress and so on. So I want to say something about chapter 7, which is another major contribution of the thesis in the book. Najmuddin al-Ghazi dies 1651, Husn al-Tanabbuh. He says, لما ورد في التشبه. Should it not be ورد? Or are both possible?
ورد, I don't think it would be ورد. ورد
Okay.
يعني ورد الحديث.
In any case, he certainly knows better than me, because Dr. Youshaa was actually collecting manuscripts of this work from the Chester Beatty Library, which I should emphasize is now known simply as the Chester Beatty. It's like a big branding thing. They dropped the library, so it's very lovely kind of place to visit in Dublin.
Okay, you've been there. I've still not been there.
Yeah, it's a really interesting. And Chester Beatty was this, I think, steel magnate or something, and he had like agents basically acquire, and it has a really impressive collection. 4,000 or 5,000. Something, it's not a huge collection, but very interesting. Dublin, yeah.
Okay.
In Dublin. So he got the and this is in the kind of preface, the first bit of the book. He got copies from Chester Beatty, not always complete, Chester Beatty and the Sulaimaniyah. And basically, he was looking for 2 copies in the Asad library in Damascus. So he spent time in Damascus. And he tried to trade the manuscripts in order to get access to the Damascus ones, but was basically fobbed off, because it turned out, as he later met with the person who edited the book, the 12-volume printed edition that came out, Dr. Nuruddin al-Talib, who kind of apologized that this had happened, gave him a CD containing all of the manuscripts, and promised him a copy of the edited book gratis. Which is a lovely gesture.
Yeah.
I should say, by the way, the acknowledgements of any book are always extremely interesting and should be read. Many people, unfortunately, neglect to read that. And the dedication, always interesting. I mean, the dedication is very movingly dedicated to Dr. Youshaa's mother, rahmahullah, and she also features in a deeply moving way in the acknowledgements. And I remember this struck me when I read the thesis as well. He really emphasizes this al-mar'u ma'a man ahab. So it's a very moving. It's hard not to speak of it without emotion. Anyway, and this especially in this chapter, the brief chapter on Sufism, but also in the Najmuddin al-Ghazi chapter, he mentions this idiom coined in the early 19th century by a British person whose name escapes me, that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. He says, citing Sufis, that actually the moral ontology of the believer is much more a function of their love and their emotional attachments than the outward actions. To a great extent. He cites this fascinating passage from Wahb bin Munabbih, I guess cited by a later source, where there's a dialogue between God and Shaitan. And Shaitan says, basically, your ibad, they say they love you, but they obey me, and they say they hate me, but they obey me. And God says, it's a wonderful, story, very moving as well, that because they love me, I forgave them their disobedience, and vice versa, because they hated you, I forgave them. So that's very interesting. So Najmuddin al-Ghazi dies 1651, son of Badruddin al-Ghazi, family originally from Gaza, but his father Badruddin was chief Shafi'i judge in Damascus. Najmuddin authored around 50 works, most famously his biographical dictionary Al-Kawakib As-Sa'ira, if I'm not mistaken. He spent about nearly 40 years working on the Husn al-Tanabbuh, and it's a really encyclopedic work. If I can summarize its structure, again, because of the kind of Sufi emphasis, it's It's bipolar. There are good and bad aspects to tashabbuh, although the bad aspects take up about 60% of the work, Dr. Youshaa tells us. Good people who you want to emulate, angels and mankind. The section on mankind breaking into sections on Salihin, in no particular order, Salihin, Shuhada, Siddiqeen, and Anbiya. These are the guys you want to be like. And the negative section discussing a variety of groups in the tripartite schema, Shaitan, I think Kathara and Fasaqa, and then these subdivide into especially the section on non-Muslims, cursed people like the people of Fir'aun and all of these down, and people of Ad and Thamud, the Kitabis, the pagans, that is non-scripturies, the Mubtadi'ah and the non-Mubtadi'ah. So it's interesting, he distinguishes between innovators and non-innovators. And under the rubric of non-innovators, he classes groups who should not be emulated, such as, firstly, children, the insane, and the kind of ignorant or unlettered. These people should strive to emulate their betters, but their betters should not emulate them. And then other groups, also non-Mubtada'a, but who should not be emulated, including women and Bedouins and such like, who both should not be emulated by their betters and should not seek to emulate their betters. Also, throughout this book, there is much discussion of non-Arab, and this is important. I mean, even Najmuddin al-Ghazi, you could say, damns Abu Saud Effendi with faint praise by saying, of all the mawali of the Arwam, and he intends it very positively, but like Abdul Ghani Nabilsi, he isn't fond of those Arwam, which is the term they used to refer to the Ottoman Turks, who prided themselves on being Rumis. They didn't call themselves Turks, they called themselves Rumis, and the imperial elite were mostly Arwam in origin.
So what's the
Arwam from Rum?
No, but what's
Rumi.
the significance of claiming to be Rumi rather than Turki?
Because in the early modern period, if you said somebody is one of the Turks in, say, the Ottoman Empire, these would be like the Bedouins and the nomads and non-sedentary people, whereas the Arwam were culturally sophisticated and what have you, and the imperial elites saw themselves as Arwam. I mean, there's some literature on this one can refer to. He says of all the, and he uses the term mawali, that's not the highest praise. He says of all the mawali of the Arwam, Abu Saud is, the most intelligent I've come across and the most diligent in applying himself to learning and so on. And this kind of Arab, non-Arab distinction does feature throughout the book. I mean, it's very much there in Ibn Taymiyyah's Iqtida' Sirat al-Mustaqim. He famously says, Muslims should strive to learn Arabic. Dr. Youshaa mentions, is it from Ibn Taymiyyah? Ibn Taymiyyah, I think, or perhaps it's in another chapter. Says one should not, waste one's time with the ratana of the Ajam, the kind of gibberish. And also, he doesn't cite it, but Michael Cook cites, I think, in Musannaf Abd Razak, if I'm not mistaken, in his book, which is actually a kind of interesting book to read alongside this one, Ancient Religions, Modern Politics, especially chapters on hierarchy. And so I really like that book of Cook's. It has some unfair critics. Anyway, Cook mentioned this story I love, which probably betrays all my prejudices, that what is it? I think one of the Sahaba, one of the Salaf kind of comes across Muslims speaking Persian. And he says, Amajusiya ba'd al-Islam, like Zoroastrians after Islam. I can see,
Youshaa has kindly
made we could
comment.
bring this up.
Sure. Okay. So Youshaa, of course, you have priority in all our discussion. So greetings, Dr. Al-Azami and Omar. To be clear, I'm not claiming that hierarchy is not present in the text, but that Muslim elites played a pivotal role in establishing hierarchical norms in their
Dr. Youshaa knows his book far better than I do, but I believe he says explicitly that he uses the language of extrinsic in the in the epilogue, he says basically the partisans of hadith kind of shaped the hadith, and so. But I mean, he's aware of the broader problem, so that's not a problem at all. Anyway, so thank you for that comment. But yeah, I mean, and yeah, so we agree on that. Like, we agree on that point.
Yeah, yeah.
But I would say then that, if it is intrinsic to the text, that raises problems that I don't think are addressed in the epilogue, because I think the epilogue tries to suggest, and then perhaps I'm misreading or misunderstanding of this, please correct me if I do, that these things are historical.
Youshaa, you're obviously welcome anytime to sort of like come on,
disagree and contest, and hopefully not insult. Anyway, just kidding. Yeah, so أمجوسيا بعد الإسلام. So this figures, and Dr. Youshaa even says in some instances you do find a conflation between like Arab Muslim and non-Arab non-Muslim. So one of the many ways Muslims are encouraged to cultivate khilaf is, they're encouraged not to imitate the Ajam, who I think in this context are the Persians specifically, and to grow out their beards. Why? Because two messengers of Kisra reportedly come to the Prophet ﷺ. There's discussed in one chapter, and they kind of clean shaven, but they have their mustaches growing out, and the Prophet is ﷺ reportedly not happy with their appearance and so on. Commands the Muslims to this practice of khalifu, how would you put that? Kind of differentiate oneself from a contradict. Yeah, which Dr. Youshaa says is the kind of
differentiate.
Yeah, so it's a kind of, he says this is the positive rhetorical flip side of the coin to do not emulate or do not assimilate, as Kister would put it, meaning positively differentiate yourselves. Now, Dr. Youshaa says in the four kind of Kutub al-Arba of 12 Shia, he did not find reference to tashabbuh in the context of Muslim non-Muslim relations. He does say to some extent taqiyya is like an inversion of this idea of because you're emulating people outwardly while disagreeing from them inwardly. There's also in 12 legal theory this idea of mukhalafat al-amma, deliberately opposing Sunnis essentially for the sake of opposing them. It's a very well-established principle in 12 Shia Usul al-Fiqh. Anyway,
is it still practiced today?
Today obviously is more, but it would be taught in any kind of standard work of Usul al-Fiqh. And one interesting thing Dr. Youshaa does is demonstrate how some of these distinctions, intra-Muslim distinctions, become aligned with, especially in the work of someone like Ibn Taymiyyah, I suppose, aligned with some of these Muslim, non-Muslim distinctions. Ibn Taymiyyah says in Iqtidas as-Sirat al-Mustaqim, even that to oppose the Shia, one should wear one signet ring on one's left hand. It's interesting, I've never had an explanation of it. It must be in Hadith, but among Shia friends, I always notice people wearing a big sort of jeweled ring, and it seems distinctively, the way it's done seems distinctively, it's always with a fairly big stone. I don't know if you've noticed this. There must be Hadith or something.
Not really. I do notice the sort of the wearing of certain types of jewelry, but the Hanafi madhab as well, it's kind of, they talk about, wearing a silver ring on the left hand little finger is something which is sunnah, and the Hanafis might be a bit more expansive in the concept of sunnah, because even resembling the Prophet's appearance in these sorts of things might be valorized, whereas that's not really a sunnah in a normative sense in sort of the Shafi'iyya, as far as I understand.
So he also mentions, I should say, in the chapter on Najmuddin al-Ghazi very briefly, the context is the crises of the Ottoman 17th century, which not entirely distant from our own, massive inflation and so on. Wars against the, not between Ukraine and the Western powers and Russia, but between the Habsburgs and the Safavids and the Ottomans. The Ottomans are fighting on two fronts, as it were, in the 17th century. So there is a kind of general atmosphere of crisis. In Europe itself, in the 17th century is indeed very chaotic, as Dr. Youshaa tells us. And there is a discussion of coffee. Standard work on this is by Ralph Haddocks. He discusses the spread of coffee houses and a versified fatwa al-Ghazi mentions, which circulates, widely in the Ottoman domains. Basically, Najmuddin al-Ghazi's perspective is coffee itself is not prohibited, so you can consume it at home. It does not cause dizziness, as the poem says, basically intoxication. However, coffee houses are problematic for all of the behaviors that tend to go on in them, whether it's the beardless use and musical instruments and the backgammon and all of this other stuff. So that's briefly his perspective on that. I haven't really spoken much about, I feel like the first half of the book hasn't received much attention so far, but I don't know if you want to comment or come in with questions.
I think, so I just want to, mention to the folks online as well that you're more than welcome to throw in your comments. And Youshaa, it's really wonderful having you on the sort of watching the discussion. And of course, any comment you make will be privileged, naturally.
Yeah.
And
thank you for writing the book.
Thank
you for writing the book, Dr. Youshaa. It's a really fantastic book.
Yeah. And I do have a whole bunch of my own questions, but perhaps we can address some of those, and then we'll come back to
sure.
Other sections of the book. Naturally, a book as rich as this, we're going to have the ability to talk about it for hours and hours. But inshallah. So. What's interesting, there are a number of things that you mentioned. The idea of, when you go back right to the beginning, you're talking about hierarchy as not intrinsically valorized in Hadith being kind of
accepting Dr. Yushaa's kind of qualification.
Being suggested by Youshaa, his sort of... Youshaa is someone I know from my Princeton days. He actually came and gave a wonderful presentation when I was there. And he also attended, a class with us, and I think Michael Cook might have been his external examiner as well. So
I wouldn't be surprised because, as we said towards the end of the last episode, the kind of gesture towards theory, which I haven't touched on at all so far, is not a perfunctory one, and there's not a sprinkling of theory; it's really there in every chapter.
Yeah.
Whether it's Freud's notion of the narcissism of small differences.
Yeah.
Or other. It's really, it informs the text without obscuring it, which is the golden mean, as it were, when it comes to
these. And it's not Michael Cook does not sort of is not interested in the sprinkling. He's not very sort of engaged in theory in any case.
Yeah, I know. But
who he has produced, like Roshan Abbasi and others, do demonstrate a serious engagement.
Although one of the main early on it was the Studio Islamica one that was on the Deen, right? And the thesis, obviously, even more so, I would say, kindly said. The Deen, one of the main, he actually uses the term over theorization. For me, this kind of debate about the usefulness of the term religion is. Anyway, I won't go down. I won't go down that rabbit hole. Anyway, sorry, you said you had questions before.
And this is also. These are arenas of debate for which you have different disciplines basically set up.
But what I mean to say, you can feel the influence of Cook is the richness, the encyclopedic coverage.
Absolutely.
He even. Encyclopedism, I think, is the right word here. The kind of close philological engagement, the detailed analysis of Asanid, that's fantastic. And many of those things, when I think of, it's clearly the product of a very rich formation, scholarly formation.
So, I guess my question here is that, or my contention perhaps, is that, it's true that you have these ideas of hierarchy embedded within certain texts. You mentioned the idea of jizya and saghar, حتى يعطوا الجزية عن يد وهم صاغرون. And the way in which that's the tafsir has been done on that kind of predominates this idea of not just hierarchy but showing that hierarchy and demonstrating it in a very direct way.
I actually remember when you came back from the US, this is forever stuck in my mind. I think it was in the Fatawa Tatar Khaniya. We were sitting next to each other in SOAS library.
I remember.
And we discussed this passage where the author says basically how the jizya should be paid. Grab the dhimmi's, lapel, as it were, and say idfa al-jizya ya adu Allah and this kind of stuff.
Now the thing is, I mean, I actually did a paper for Michael Cook where I was looking at that phrase, tafsir of that phrase, وَهُمْ صَاغِرُونَ, across time and madhahib. I mean, I should actually revisit that paper and think about publishing it. It's something which is on my mind, but the thing is, I mean, there is variation.
Of course.
It
could just be the upper hand, taking the money as opposed to having it dropped into your hand.
Right.
I mean, Kista has a paper on an yadin and the meaning of that phrase, which is well known. Yeah.
But I mean, I just think that I think there is a case to be argued, and this is what a scholar you're not a great fan of, but I mean, like, I think he has a good point to make here. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, rahmatullahi alayhi.
I wouldn't say that's unfair. Well, I say
no. I mean, like, on these sorts of issues, on his fiqh al-jihad, like, you had some reservations.
Anyway.
But I mean, obviously, he has made sort of like major contributions. I'm not sort of. I know that you never questioned that. But rahmatullahi alayhi. But on these sorts of issues, he is being driven by this kind of egalitarian imperative of our age, almost. I would argue, and what I see and what I feel in these sorts of texts. I mean, you kind of have mentioned many a time Khalid Blankenship's fantastic work, The End of the Jihad State. But whether it's Professor Blankenship or indeed Omar Anjum made a recent comment about this in a podcast he did with Shadi Hamid, which is very interesting because he's basically engaging his discourses on the Khilafah with Shadi Hamid and a Christian sort of a conversation partner of Shadi's. But my impression from that work, which it's been a while since I read, is that there is an implicit sort of critique by people like Blankenship, and Omar makes this as well, that this leaning into the possibility of an absolute sort of all-out jihad on a global scale is one of the things which was ultimately the downfall of the Umayyads. And so, that's something which isn't necessary or essential to be read into the tradition, and the later tradition. Yeah, I mean,
look, if you're making the very basic point that one can, at the very least, distinguish the Quran from the later tradition, that's an obvious historical point to make, and that's very easy to do. What I would say is that you cannot, even from the Quran, I mean, it uses the word saghar. There's no two ways about it. I mean, you cannot extricate it from the religious texts entirely. Well, certainly there's a difference between the Quranic and post-Quranic, elements. But
so people like Qaradawi, again, like he will say, well, what does saghar mean? And he says, he draws on a Shafi'i and says, yujra alayhim ahkam al-Islam, or something like this, right? That's all it means. It doesn't have all of this additional kind of like, also demean them as well, right?
Yeah, but again, in the context of modern equality. Right? Yeah, in the context of modern egalitarianism, I mean, that's also seen as problematic. I mean, there's no escape. I
mean, so that's on the historical side. Then on the modern side, my other sort of like contention, and this is something, I have probably articulated to you a few times, is that, like, there's this pretense that we live in a time of egalitarianism, which just, it's really one of these fundamental myths of our time, right? This is part of the modern religion.
And Dr. Youshaa does anticipate this criticism to some extent, but an uncharitable reader, which I'm not, would even would even suggest there's a certain political naivete here. I don't think Dr. Youshaa is in any sense unaware of this point. I mean, he talks about it, he anticipates this criticism, but we do live in a world,
I lived in the US for a period, right? And I could just feel the overwhelming pressures to ideologically conform. I mean, it's one of the reasons, I was actually quite dissatisfied with various aspects of my time in Princeton. Notwithstanding just the extraordinary resources that it had, the degree to which I felt ideological policing was unrelenting. And so in that sort of sense, I can understand a desire to, engage in a cognitively dissonant practice on the part of many of us. And, I don't sort of say that I was exempt from that necessarily. But I do think that there's an interesting dilemma of living in a place like the US and trying to construct thought, because you're under these unrelenting pressures, and we are as well, of course, in a place like, even though being a son of Dar al-Islam in Tower Hamlets, it's a bit. I think I have that sort of a certain degree of.
I mean, it's not always clear who his audience is in the epilogue, because sometimes he talks a lot about Muslims in the US, and other times it's kind of more general, and he talks about the modern world. I think Muslims in the US are in an interesting position in the sense that they're really, if you'll forgive the metaphor, a pimple on a giant's arse, in the sense that they're a tiny minority, according to the best estimates, about 1% of the population, not like the 6.5% in England and Wales. And there's a huge difference in those, and also very disparate, spread. Of course, you have concentrations in parts, some places.
Also remarkably assimilated, right?
And I think, if you're a minority that's that small and that, relatively speaking, insignificant, I think basically there's everything.
Crucially, if you're socioeconomically integrated to that degree, your values very quickly adapt to the values of the majority. In a way that if you're working class, it's very difficult to assimilate in that way.
And we've had this conversation, you and I, many times, you with the benefit of having lived in the US for 5 years. But I think really there's everything to lose by not asserting difference in the American context, because, it's overwhelmed just numerically and otherwise. And I think similarly for cultural reasons, the Brits in some sense keep to themselves, but for cultural reasons, the pressures of assimilation in the US are more intense, I would say. It's interesting because the book, the kind of preface or forward or whatever it is, before the introduction, begins with Dr. Youshaa's experience in Edinburgh. He did spend the initial years of his life actually in Scotland. His family migrated in 1973 from Bombay to Scotland.
He doesn't have an accent at all.
No, he left when he was young, of course. I was born in Glasgow, but I don't speak Scots. Glasgow, another one of the great, fortresses of Islam. I'm sure Sahib Said would find that very funny as a Glaswegian. Anyway, and actually one of the things that prompted his parents' move from Scotland to the US was discrimination in schooling. And it's really interesting because when I think back to my own childhood, my parents in Scotland from about 1984 to 1990, I think actually they had a better experience in Scotland than they did in England in the 1990s. In the 1990s, very similar forms of discrimination they encountered. Things are much easier now in many ways than they were. It's easy to forget that, in 1981, you had the Brixton riots, which were the worst, kind of race related. They were the worst episodes of civil disturbance, in basically 2 centuries since the Gordon riots in the 1780s. And, that prompted, the Macpherson report. Eventually, there were some reports in the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, the Macpherson report. So if you kind of look at the history of race relations in the UK, there were watershed moments, especially in the 1990s, especially under the first Blair government, that are very interesting. But things were very different in the 70s and 80s. They were certainly much worse. And as a result, we lost Youshaa forever to America.
But
anyway,
their gain. I must say that I wonder if there is an engagement with the category of citizenship in any sort of
I think it features in the footnotes, and he does speak of social citizenship, yes, as I mentioned.
Right.
But you, Osam, I think in recent episodes you made this point about, the dividing line in Western societies is between citizens and non-citizens, and non-citizens basically can be rendered or droned or anything. That's the distinction that matters in this context. That's not egalitarian.
More mundane than that, but the mundane suffering is, quite acute a lot of the time as well. The levels of exclusion that non-citizens suffer. Or like my wife is a naturalized British citizen at this point, and when we moved to the UK, that took around 5.5, 6 years for her to become a full citizen. But just the process is, one could say traumatizing. I mean, it's certainly traumatizing to the wallet, and so those sorts of things are institutionalized forms of discrimination, which we live in Brexit land, of course, and this is one of the fundamental components of Brexit, which is I don't think often enough sort of discussed and studied, is the amount of xenophobia and nostalgia for empire it was grounded in. So yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to think that we do live, but I think one of the things that Youshaa could come back on this is with respect to is saying that, look, normatively that stuff is rejected, but with respect to the xenophobia associated with Brexit or something like this. But what I would argue is, well, normatively citizenship is like the only game in town when it comes to, and that is fundamentally discriminatory. And even someone as far left as Bernie Sanders, you can watch this fascinating discussion when he was running for president with what's his name, Ezra Klein, formerly of Vox. Now he's involved with a number of different organizations, but very sort of influential sort of liberal pundit in the US, a young liberal pundit. And he was basically he was pressing Bernie Sanders on the question of immigration and saying, look, do you basically believe in open borders and letting anyone in? And he said, no, of course not. I believe in the nation state. So as far left as that, I mean, he's going to say, look, for the coherence of having a nation state, you do need to enforce borders. You need to have citizens and non-citizens. Yeah. And, I think, sure, within the global logic of, contemporary sort of international order and the idea of nationalism as the defining feature of the defining unit of the international order, sure, but don't pretend that's not like a virulent form of discrimination.
Which is, of course, not something we're asserting against Dr. Youshaa, but as a general...
No, not Dr. Youshaa. I mean, I'm just saying that more generally, that we live in this time where we have these sort of myths, which, for me are indistinguishable from, religious ontologies, for example.
So...
I did have other questions. If you,
of course, sure. I want to say something about chapters 1 and 3 and 4. Chapter 1, as I said, really turning away literally from Jews and Christians. There's a discussion of the Qibla, practices of dress, grooming of hair, and headgear, I think also features in later chapters, and calendar, which is really interesting. So, Dr. Youshaa mentions the fact that reportedly the Medinan Jews would say when the Prophet ﷺ prayed facing Jerusalem, he follows our Qibla but opposes our religion. And I mean, there's a long debate about, and he kind of discusses, for more than a century, Western scholars of Islam have been kind of emphasizing the change in Qibla as a decisive break with the Jews. I mean, he says this is, it's a bit more complicated than that. Although he recognizes it is a kind of sort of form of dramatic self-assertion in a particular way, but Jerusalem does not lose its religious value, of course. And I think he cites Fazl Rahman and Angelica Neuwirth. Fazl Rahman actually saying it has more to do with the value of the Kaaba as this kind of Abrahamic site, and Arabian shrine to the one creator. And Neuwirth saying this reversion to the Meccan Qibla suggests a kind of, it's like the exilic longing that the Jews have for Jerusalem, but it's kind of, in the Arabian kind of context. But initially he says, Dr. Youshaa, citing Ibn Abbas, I mean, there was a period when the Prophet ﷺ actually enjoyed emulation and tashabbuh of kitabis. And for example, so he gives this example of that he would let his ﷺ, I don't have enough hair to do it anymore. Let his kind of hair hang over his forehead rather than parting it. And it's interesting because once tashabbuh becomes a thing to be avoided, dhimmis in the pact of Omar and the time of Omar ibn Abdul Aziz, they trim their forelocks. And one reason why they are this kind of idea of what is muqassas, the muqassas becomes like a shorthand for dhimmi. And they also distinguish themselves in a number of other ways. I mean, he said, citing or referring to Kister and Goldsey, most of the hadith against tashabbuh are really, or the key anxiety is about tashabbuh with the Jews. Now, but there are other groups, of course, whom one is urged not to imitate. I mean, he mentions in a later chapter Omar saying, emphasizing that to oppose the pagan Arabs, instead of practicing talbid, which is the practice of braiding one's hair with gum when coming out of the state of ihram, one should save it. So there are other groups, and he mentions this debate about the hadith of the lizard hole and entering the lizard hole. It was discussed whether this is a reference to the Jews and Christians or to the Romans and Persians and so on. And another context in which tashabbuh is important, I said, is this question of calendar. Now we know, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, that Muslims established their distinctive calendar very early, according to the tradition, between the years 636 and 639 during the reign of Omar radiallahu anhu. And we have papyrus evidence dated to the year 22, establishing that. And we even have the earliest kind of obviously Muslim tombstone, or to me it's obviously Muslim, dated I think 31. Abdurrahman bin Khair al-Hajri in Qarafa, interestingly, which uses the Basmala, which...
Qarafa in Egypt?
Yeah, in Fustat, or outside Fustat, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean now it's part of Cairo, but yeah.
631?
No, the year 31 after the Hijrah.
Okay, sorry.
I mean, it was conquered in the time of Omar, so under Amr ibn al-As.
644, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so
around 644, I think.
It's very early, and it uses the Basmala, which I think in Neuwirth he says argues goes back to the Middle Meccan period at least, and it uses a Hijri date, the year 31, and he kind of draws on Sean Anthony, who really emphasizes the kind of ideological weight of a new calendrical system. And this is accompanied by the Quranic denunciation of nasi, or intercalation, which I think is normally understood to be denunciation of the pagan Arabs' practice of intercalation, so they can avoid لِيُحِلُّوا مَا حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ, is it the Quranic phrase?
إِنَّمَا النَّسِيءُ
زِيَادَةٌ فِي الْكُفْرِ is the key kind of criticism.
So I can't remember the rest. But I mean, like the idea of the fact they would try and get the lunar and the solar calendars aligned regularly.
Yeah, because certain prohibitions associated with the sacred months. But the Jews still observe a lunisolar calendar, in order to keep the lunar months basically kind of up with the solar months. Yeah. And this is, one could say, another form of ziyadatun fil kufr, because, I mean, if your religious observances like the fast of Ramadan are tied to particular months, I mean, your Ramadan fast is invalid if you fast in Shawwal. It's not accepted.
Right.
And also, he mentions dicta of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, suggesting that the time is restored. What is it? قد دارت الأزمان, or something like this. That's not the exact phrase, but that's the meaning. I mean, to the same it was when God created the samawati wal ard. So This guy, and obviously this is sends a very strong political signal, and the fact that it's dated to the John, and Dr. Youshaa disagrees with Donner and his Believers thesis, which is another story, and he says it's very unlikely that we would have something like a distinctive calendrical system and not have distinct rituals and a distinct identity and so on, which is a nice point to make, I think, because obviously
also, go ahead.
Because a calendar, it happens after the Prophet ﷺ. There's no disagreement about that as far as I know, and it's something you have to put quite a lot of thought into, as the tradition reports indeed. So, something like ritual, which features heavily in the Quran, obviously must have preceded that in some sense, distinctive ritual. Interestingly, he mentions Hoyland in Seeing Islam as Others Saw It, which is his first book, I think in 98, making this point about, when we look at early non-Muslim sources, evidently we're seeing the emergence of a distinctive religious tradition. Although, as far as I remember, Hoyland seemingly endorses the Believers thesis, if memory serves, in The Path of God, his book on jihad and the early conquests. But it's, I obviously do not endorse that thesis, and I agree with Kroner and Jack Tenusa's criticisms of it, but I don't want to be distracted because there's more to discuss in the book. So,
I wanted to ask about sort of the calendrical point. Is there any reflection, perhaps in the epilogue, about the fact that that's actually one of the respects in which imperialism, Western imperialism continues, right? we are all, subjected to.
To the extent that something I thought about a lot a few years ago, it really it's so taken for granted that there's a point in one's life where it takes a real leap of the imagination to think oneself outside of that space. Yes, Europe did remake the world in its image, and I think there's even a subtitle in one of the chapters of Youshaa's book along those lines. So obviously it's something he's aware of. But the fact that Vision 2030 is Vision 2030 and not Vision, and a Saudi only in a few years ago, I think it was the last Muslim majority country to drop. It's still widely used. When I was living in Saudi, obviously, and everyone would understand it in a way is not true in other Muslim countries. Yeah. But the Hijri calendar was officially dropped as the official calendar. Now, I love this book and there's a lot has been now written on temporal cultures and cultures of time. This Avi Wishnitza's book. Reading Clocks a la Turca or something like, or a la Franca. It's a fantastic book on temporal cultures in the kind of modern Ottoman period. Because, and Saudi and Yemen and other contexts like those are often the best tools to think with. Things that are taken for granted today, the use of Rumi time, the fact that Muslims in the 19th and early 20th century, the midnight hour for their watches was Maghrib, so it had to be adjusted every day. In Saudi, this only changed in the night. Yeah, in Saudi, this changed a few decades ago, and it's still, these things persist.
Did they still in the masjids? When I lived in Saudi in the 90s, in the masjids, you'd have two clocks at the front, one on,
basically, once that older generation dies out, everyone grows up in the new kind of environment. I didn't see any old clocks using the older style. Maybe one or something, but it's very marginal now. But that's a function of power. The West is able to impose its calendrical system and its way of understanding time, and by virtue of its power. Why do we call it the common era? Anyway.
It's really fascinating because what you have in the West, of course, now is it's moved from, there are people who are disgruntled, of course, that why can't we call it Christian era anymore? Now it's called common era. But by calling common era, you kind of standardize and normativize.
You naturalize it, as it were.
Norm. Yeah.
And this is the thing. Our world is fraught with hierarchy and with the relations of power and so on. I think the difference is Ibn Taymiyyah is valorizing a different hierarchy of power.
Of course.
Than George Bush.
Right,
Yeah.
right, and I think I think when I mentioned Bernie Sanders, I'm not sort of necessarily criticizing him within his own paradigm. I'm just saying that any normative system requires those kinds of boundary drawing exercises. This is something we also discussed a couple of weeks ago, and I think very often this is something I grapple with, and I'd love to have the opportunity to talk to Youshaa about as well and discuss with him. But our anxieties about these sorts of things are a function of the strength of that normative force that makes us feel uncomfortable, whereas I think it's a function of power ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, Muslims often, especially in the US context, refer to Du Bois's notion of double consciousness. I mean, very true, And I think, what's his name? Hamid Dabashi even has this great book whose title escapes me. I read some years ago. He speaks of
black faces, white masks.
No. That's Fanon. I mean, I'm talking about Dabashi.
Yeah, he has his.
All right, yeah. I mean, Dabashi is a kind of interesting character. And somebody of whom one should not do tashabbuh, incidentally. I mean, but he is interesting to think with. He had this line in one of his books where he says, Muslims should be comfortable. They feel as though whenever they speak, there's someone, they have to look over their shoulders, as it were. Right. Yeah. Whereas, the apex of creation and their conceited self-understanding, they, the white European who Hegel regards as the, culmination of human history, I mean, do not have this sense. I mean, of course, you have hierarchy also within, between, some poor some poor guy, who is barely making ends meet and is a supermarket worker, obviously isn't really enjoying in his daily life this kind of immense power. So we're speaking in a particular way. I mean,
sure. I mean, but I think the point that you're making, which is quite important, is that there is a sense of when you have power, you have a kind of freedom that is very difficult to enjoy. I mean, like this is a sense in which Mohammed bin Salman is a slave, right? I mean, he may be the richest man de facto on the planet. By virtue of the fact that these places don't have constitutions, and he basically uses the entire wealth of Saudi Arabia as a personal bank account. But
I think it's probably
he is still sorry.
Yeah, no, because
he is still a slave.
Yeah. I mean, he's also operating in a system that he didn't make or build, or he's a participant in a system, or he's playing a game whose rules have been made by someone else.
I mean, that's
I often
for, like even white Western European.
Of course, but I mean, I often like to use this language of games and rules because it kind of trivializes and denaturalizes these structures, which I think is important. It's important to be subversive like this. And I think that way about academia, by the way. Not that I want to lose my job, but academic discourse is a game with particular rules. And these rules are often regarded as inviolable and sacred, and I think things are a bit more complicated than that. Yeah. And the Muslim scholarly tradition has rules of its own that are somewhat different. There is some overlap, of course. I don't want to overstate the differences either.
Of course. I was just going to say, I mean, incidentally, like I use game sometimes in this sort of discourse, drawing on the work of Jeffrey Stout, one of my professors at Princeton, who fascinating thinker. He's written a book called Democracy and Tradition, among various other important and influential books. But he does talk about drawing on another sort of philosophical writer, a pragmatist, and pragmatism is one of these great American philosophical traditions. Great in however you wish to understand that. But I mean, I like Jeff's work, and yeah, I mean, like recognizing that he uses game in a far more serious sense, actually. So that it can be used in, I guess you're using it in trivializing sense, and it can be used in other senses as well. But I wanted to, I mean, we have been going on for an hour and a half, and I wanted to ask a couple of other questions.
Could I say something very briefly about, because just so the first part of the book isn't too badly neglected, I mean, there is a nice discussion of this issue. I think it's in the first chapter. Standing at funerals. So Bukhari reports that the Prophet ﷺ stood at funerals, and Muslim reports that he both stood and sat down for them. Bukhari excludes reports about his deliberate sitting, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the assumption being that he does not regard these as well transmitted or normative. But Dr. Youshaa tells us that most jurists basically side with Muslims' implicit understanding that, as is found in some hadith even, that standing for funeral processions is a Jewish custom. So when tashabbuh became this blameworthy thing, the Prophet ﷺ sat down as a kind of way of kind of distinguishing himself from them. And there's lots of discussion, interestingly, of hair dyeing and headgear. So one point he kind of riffs on later in the epilogue that he makes relatively early in the book is the Muslims are encouraged, or the kind of style cultivated by the Prophet ﷺ is the wearing of a cap or qalansuwa with a turban. This is not entirely foreign to the Arabian context, but it is distinctive. So he talks about how al-Jahid says, there are two types of qalansuwa, and Muslims were initially hostile to the taller form, but then it was adopted because it was a kind of court dress of the Sasanians. Anyway, that's another story. But because the Arabians wore imam, as far as understood, the Arabians wore imamas, and the qalansuwa was more of a Ajami thing. Right. And the combination is greater than the sum of its parts and is distinctively Muslim. And on dyeing of hair, because you find all sorts of material on this. Dr. Youshaa mentions that in the early Abbasid period, Mukhannathun, which Rosen would translate as effeminates, would dye their hair eccentric colors. But a number of jurists prohibited Muslims from dyeing their hair black. Yeah. But Muslims were encouraged to dye their hair to distinguish themselves from Kitabis in particular, to grow their beards out and we had the episode on Aaron's book. Another important form of anti kind of tashabbuh measure being prayer in shoes, which Aaron discusses at great length, and people can refer to that episode for more details. And they're both kind of inspired by Kister on this. So the dyeing of hair also interesting in various ways. Yeah.
So really fascinating on the dyeing of hair. I remember sort of reading as a young boy, probably a teenager, the idea that Abu Bakr did khidab, and essentially my understanding from what I was reading is that dyeing one's hair sort of a ginger or a blondish color was almost recommended or something, and I was like, I've never seen that.
You see even in Bern here, you see guys with henna in their heads and in their beards. Yeah. Somalis do it quite a lot, I've noticed. Right. So they've kind of tried to cultivate this.
Some of the reports that I was reading at the time, and I don't recall. I get the impression that they would have been fairly strong. These would have probably been Salafi texts that I was reading because I was based in Saudi Arabia at the time. It basically said this is the shi'ar of the mu'min, and it's extremely strongly emphasized. I think in some of those hadiths. He
even mentions in some tafsir of kind of fairly marginal view, but nonetheless interesting, or perhaps interesting because of that fact, of yazidu fi al-khalqi ma yasha in Surah Fatir. Talks anyway. Some people even said he increases people in their beards as he wills, and Youshaa does describe, and we had again this chapter on Aaron Rocksinger's lovely book, which discusses facial hair as well, quite a lot, and there's the kathif, and but as Ibn Taymiyyah says in chapter 5. Muslims are originators, so if non-Muslims then start growing out their beards as they do in Philadelphia, then Muslim, it's not that you then have to do khilaf of that, because Muslims originate, they don't imitate that makes sense.
Right, fascinating. Yeah, I mean, just on Philadelphia. Philadelphia seems to be a very interesting place. I mean,
There's actually a paper,
yeah.
or more than one paper, but Aaron Roxinger sent it to me. Joel Bletcher is one of the co-authors, actually talking about this Muslim aesthetic thing, and it's spread outside the borders of the Muslim community in places like a Germantown in Philadelphia, you know, non-Muslims cultivating like big beards and rolling up their pant legs.
And wearing thobe as well. I mean, like Sherman
that
Jackson
one I
was
hadn't
once
heard
saying,
of.
Sherman Jackson saying that, you know, you can go to Philly and sort of like, he once went to Philly and he saw a man in a thobe and he needed to pray, and he's like, you know, can you tell me where the nearest masjid is? And he's like, yeah, I'm not a Muslim. He's wearing a thobe. Right?
Yeah.
But he's a black.
Philadelphia is another fortress of Islam, evidently.
Mashallah, mashallah.
And I think even in some parts of it, the adhan is given as broadcast, as far as I know.
I wouldn't be surprised, actually.
I've heard this.
I know, like one of my colleagues at Yaqeen, Dr. Tahir Wyatt, is certainly of the view that, or almost.
I mean, he taught in the Medinan Haram for like a long time, as far as I remember.
Mashallah.
Yeah.
And now
I think the first Westerner to teach in either of the Haramain.
Right.
But it was for a long period, like 20 years or something.
It would not surprise me, mashallah.
I think
he looks very young, mashallah. So but 20 years is quite remarkable. But you know, mashallah, he's a learned scholar for the whole. I wanted to ask just on the Ibn Taymiyyah point, something which just picking up on something which was mentioned earlier. So Ibn Taymiyyah, of course, you know, the disparaging of the A'ajim to a certain extent and their customs. This is something you find, you know, early on in the writings of the Salaf, basically.
I mean, actually, it's more emphasized the earlier you go, because I think it was last week where we talked about this. The Arabs were living in Amsar and tribal kind of settled tribal fashion. And you had to, if you were to convert, you would affiliate and become a mawla of somebody, and you were integrated in a sense in the tribal structure. Of course, that broke down the tribal structures fairly quickly in urban settings, and really for a great kind of discussion of how that process unfolded. I mean, Nur al-Safrir's book on the Aqila in early Islamic law is outstanding.
Yeah.
I think I reviewed it. If
you have reviewed it,
summary.
It's on your academia page.
I really like that book. I mean, Nurat's work is really good.
But just the point, I guess.
Oh yes,
asking about,
and I just wanted to say sorry. Last week we criticized it when people said Ibn Taymiyyah is Kurdish. We find the same claim being made.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And his father was certainly an Arab. There's as far as I know, no discussion of that, doubt about that. And then the lineage and race and these things are traced patrilineally, of course. So he regarded himself as an Arab.
So, to a certain extent, one could argue for a kind of Arab chauvinism in some of these sorts of writings. But at the same time, my understanding is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, like when you probe what is an Arab, they basically say that, look, you know, it's al-Arabiyyatu Arabiyyatu lisan.
Yeah, which as far as I remember is Ibn Taymiyyah's view. So, in the same way you have this question in the 20th century, who is a Turk, and the Kurds are mountain Turks, and, happy is he who calls himself a Turk, and all this funny business.
Stuff is obviously
Turkey, Anatolia is a extremely mixed ethnically, linguistically, historically society. So, a Turk is not, some pure blood who comes from Central Asia. And in the understanding of Turkish nationalism, it's really more to do with culture and language, which can obviously be easily acquired in a lifetime. I mean, in a childhood.
Certainly language. What's interesting is that those are, of course, nation-building projects as well, right? Yeah. I mean, that's what's very distinctive about the modern nationalist discourse and the imagination of the reimagining of communities. But I guess you have prototypical versions of that throughout history, of course. And I mean, if al-Arabiyyatu Arabiyyatu lisan, then presumably that's not really a chauvinistic principle in quite the same way.
It depends on what one means by chauvinism, I suppose, but I mean... Because the kind of... the opposite of this would be... people like Al-Jahid and Ibn Qutaybah, who are really the champions of the cultural Arabicate project, or whatever you want to call it. They're fighting this culture war, if we can speak of a culture war in that Bezid period, against the Shawbis, who are valorizing especially the culture of Persians, but also other cultures. And that's, in some ways, it's a struggle for the soul of Islam, or was. And I've always felt this way. I mean, I have reservations about Arab nationalism, of course, the what is it, Risala Khalida of the Hizb al-Ba'ath is not Islam, it is Arabism, and if that means that Abu Jahl is
form of kufr potentially.
That means I should care more about Abu Jahl than Bilal, and that's ignorance of the worst kind. But I think really, non-Arab nationalisms are categorically problematic just by their nature, because you poke a little on, and this is even in Al-Jahid's kind of criticisms of the Shawbi. I can't remember where he talks about Shawbism as a kind of almost even nifaq, because you scratch just a little bit under the surface. In modern non-Arab nationalisms, resentment of Arabs is operating not very, very far beneath the surface. And I regard that
give specific examples.
In
Lebanon,
Persians say Arab a lot. Well, some of them, but even Rob was telling me, Rob Gleif, who lived in Iran for some time and speaks the language and all of this, that random Iranians would come up to him and not to generalize, but this was something experienced. They would say, "Oh, well, you British, you have farhang or culture or whatever it is, and Arabs don't have it." And, especially because Iran has its kind of proud imperial history, which the Pahlavi dynasty did a lot to cultivate. But, that leads to unbelief and hypocrisy extremely easily. It's only one step. Because it's one step until you say, these herders of mangy camels, they destroyed our glorious civilization, and they changed the P sound to an F sound. So instead of saying peel, we say feel. And it's non-Arab nationalisms are, I think, intrinsically problematic for me, religiously speaking.
Right. And the thing is, what's
and Arab nationalism has problems as well.
You're talking about.
I don't know how we got onto this.
Sorry. We're talking about Arab superiority and the idea of tashabbuh. And the thing is, nationalism as a concept, of course, is the valorizing of the ethnos rather than the religious tradition. But what I guess someone like Ibn Taymiyyah is talking about. We had a brief discussion of this in a seminar a few weeks ago where we had Dr. Omar participating, and he was asked about Ibn Taymiyyah's view on sort of Arab superiority or something along those lines. And I can't recall if this was Dr. Anjum's interpretation or if this was kind of, just relaying what Ibn Taymiyyah said, but something along the lines of, well, at the end, one way of understanding this is, yes, there are reports which seem to valorize, Arabs, but al-Arabiyyah to Arabiyyatul lisan, that's one dimension. And the other dimension is it's an understanding that, if this results in greater taqwa, because that's the ultimate sort of measure, and knowing Arabic gives you greater access potentially to these sources.
In some sense.
So that's the only form of legitimate nationalism in these.
In some sense, to kind of revert to the first question. In some sense, it's a this-worldly distinction that has basically zero impact in an otherworldly sense. Why? Because you can be a Hanafi and say that, Qurashi, non-Qurashis and Qurashi, there's a bar of marriage, and non-Arabs and Arabs. The Hanafis have the most kinds of stringent views on kufr and marriage, and the kind of Malikis occupy the opposite end of the spectrum in this regard. Ibn Hazm, I remember reading in the Muhalla, said, and he's very critical of these notions of kafa'a as, grounded. The Hanafis, talk about profession and, hiraf and, genealogy and Sayyid versus non-Sayyid and all of this. Ibn Hazm says the daughter of a Qurashi caliph is kufr, or an Ethiopian or something is kufr for the. It's very interesting. Yeah, but I mean that's a function of his kind of textualist orientation, and there is a kind of egalitarian impulse to some extent in Ibn Hazm. Right.
I mean, لا فضل لعربي على عجمي إلا بالتقوى.
Yeah, and I mean that's really the key point, because what's the hadith about men basically whoever is the paraphrase, whoever's about his genealogy and deeds.
من ادعى غير أبيه.
No.
That one.
I'm thinking of basically. I mean, if your deeds are insufficient, your genealogy won't.
من أبطأ به عمله لم يسرع به نسبه.
Precisely, and that's something everyone agrees in. So this is not a question of religious merit in that sense. It's really mostly a discussion of this worldly merit. But there is an element where, I mean, when Ibn Taymiyyah is talking about bid'ah and tashabbuh, then the non-Arab element does become quite prominent, because obviously many of the Salaf were not Arabs, but this often features in polemical anti-bid'ah discourse.
This is what's interesting, right? I mean, when you see someone like Sufyan al-Thawri disparaging a certain practice, is saying هذا من عادة الأعاجم, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just sort of like, I mean, I think it might have been a case of like using ma in istinja, right? And I'm like, well, that's one of those practices which I don't mind adopting, my friend. I mean, Sufyan al-Thawri ala ra'si طبعا يعني.
Yeah, of course, Muslims adopted a great deal of these things, as Dr. Youshaa says, whether it's the first and Spiegel literature in the case of, Abbasids from Iranian cult. I mean, Abbasids leaning towards Iranian, and Umayyads adopting many Roman administrative practices and so on.
Right.
But we should,
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, the epilogue, it's really interesting, because obviously we're living in a non-Muslim majority context. Like, I really want to stress, like, I have, many, this is a bit like one of those, I can't, anyway, but genuine friendships with, non-Muslims, and I don't think,
Sure.
How would I put it? I mean, I think it's natural when you live among people that ties of amity and love develop, very, very naturally.
And it's countenanced in the Quran. I mean, notwithstanding some of the aqwal of the Salaf, but the idea that you can marry a non-Muslim for a man.
Yeah, as we discussed in the last episode.
Yeah, I mean,
and
how could you contemplate?
Well, Dr. Youshaa makes precisely that point,
right,
citing a German Muslim, and I think Sherman Jackson has also mentioned this in my hearing once. How can you, marry and have children with someone you don't love?
Yeah.
But that's a very, I sent someone a few months ago, I'd have to look it up again, but like early Ibadi discussions of wala do discuss this and say, you have no wala for Ibadis, but you can marry their woman. Like, so understanding of what marriage is, hierarchical arrangement, producing children and so on, and the modern, I don't want to say modern understandings of love, because you do have romantic love obviously in pre-modern Arabic literature.
Absolutely,
but I don't think
saying that Aisha is the most beloved person to him, right?
But I wouldn't I still wouldn't say this point about marriage proves the point about love.
So I mean, this is what Muhammad al-Hassan Wal-Dado basically is arguing in discussions of wala and bara. He's got a series of lectures where he talks about wala and bara, and he's saying that look, some of the discussions in recent sort of decades have been quite unbalanced, because once again, and he uses the example of marriage, and he says, look, you can have wala and bara for an idea and a belief system, and still have the natural human impulse to feel loving feelings towards a mother or a brother or a well, I mean, not necessarily if you've converted out of this, out of another tradition into Islam, like other relatives, or indeed if your spouse is a Jewish or Christian, you can have that, but you also have the bara from their beliefs, right? I mean, that has to be non-negotiable.
I mean, some of the most interesting discussions I've seen of this question are Abadi, both ancient, very old ones, and modern. I mean, Valerie Hoffman has discussed this, and in the context of both modern and early Abadism. I mean, and we often forget how central these questions were in early Islamic theology. I mean, not just the Shia and Abadis, but they were, they were very important.
So Valerie does discuss this in
various articles on Ibadism, which I have on my hard drive, I'm sure. But I mean, I have non-Muslim friends. I mean, I have non-Muslim mentors even. I mean, Rob Cleave, and I love Rob Cleave, and I love my friends, but you can cultivate an ethic of good neighborliness even towards people you're not especially close to. Whereby like Midwesterners supposedly do, you bring them apple pie when they move into the neighborhood, and you help them move house by packing. I mean, I think those are real meaningful gestures, distinct from just kind of fake friendliness, like actually helping someone, absolutely. Willingness to lend them money when they're hard up. Like I think that's all of that belongs to this kind of ethos of good neighborliness that doesn't contradict even the most kind of stringent understandings of.
I mean, the Prophet ﷺ's shield was pawned to a Jewish person, I think, when he passed away. You mentioned Rob Cleave. We all love Rob Cleave, right? His many sort of Muslim students / mentees. We all have a great deal of admiration for him and love for him. And it's for me, it's very heartfelt. I mean, he's just when I see Rob, I actually hug him. It's kind of like the English don't do that very often, right? And so,
I remember, the late great Van Koningsveld. I mean, had a number of Muslim students, and I was speaking to one of them, whom I won't name for privacy reasons. Who said, it's very clear if you speak to Van Koningsveld's students that his students, like his PhD students, they genuinely loved him. And they had tremendous respect for him. I mean, this friend was saying how distraught he was. They talked to him about Islam, and he didn't end up becoming Muslim, and he was very kind of concerned for him. And so But that is also a feeling that comes from a place, or can come from a place at least of genuine love. It doesn't have to be chauvinistic superiority. And in any case, I mean, who is assured of their own salvation? That is the worst, crime of all.
I mean, this is really interesting. It reminds me of the conversation that I was looking at. I mean, it's still on. I haven't finished listening to it on my Spotify, but so I'm just going to draw it up so that I can say the title of it. But I mean, basically, does the world need a caliphate? Is a discussion on zealots at the gate, which is Shadi Hamid and a Christian colleague of his, kind of evangelical Christian colleague of his,
like a theologian or something.
I think so, a theologian, one of the interesting discussions that they have is about da'wah and the desire for... And so Ovema says, of course, I forget the name of the Christian gentleman, but I would love for him to become Muslim. That's something that I would greatly desire. And Shadi Hamid is a sort of old friend of mine from Oxford, and he's now at Brookings, but he's very much a liberal, and he basically says, no, that's actually not something I desire. And the Christian gentleman was saying, well, Shadi, actually, this is something which I feel hurt by, because I would hope that if you think you have the truth, that I would be worthy of being a recipient of that, and that's that's how you would manifest your love, and that's the way in which,
both Islam and Christianity. I mean, this context of late antiquity, they are missionary religions, so to speak. I mean.
Liberalism is as well. I mean, that was the point that I thought it was missing in all of this discussion.
Exactly.
Shadi misses this quite dramatically, but I think the other participants, Dr. Omar could have pointed out, because he says at one point, obviously I think Islam is a wonderful thing, and I wish for the whole world to accept it. But I also recognize that the Quran itself recognizes that that's not going to happen. Yeah. But
that does bring me to a point I want to mention. Shadi
is a liberal, and he would love the whole world to be liberal. And
that's the thing. There are actually institutional mechanisms to enforce conformity
Yes.
that is not the case for these religious worldviews. Anyway, one thing that bothered me about the epilogue, and again, I don't want to misrepresent Dr. Youshaa, he kind of he says,
I don't think you'll be misrepresenting. At the end of the day, we are reviewers, and reviewers in what they focus on reflect their own interests.
Of course, and I'm happy to share my notes, which I often do with authors of books to show that I've read it carefully, and I think at about a bit more than 6,000 words for this book, with the notes I took. So a few things. So he says, we should recognize that anyone can be a moral exemplar or a failure. I mean, like you interact with, it could be Rob, it could be Aaron, who I really very deeply fond of, any number of people we could name. And obviously, a good character in that sense of how you deal with other people, patience and good manners, that's something that's independent of religion in a sense. Right. But, that is to secularize character, because part of character is dealing with your fellow man or woman, as it were, and part of character is also adab with God. Right. So to be a kind of complete moral exemplar like the Prophet ﷺ, you don't only have to be, nice to animals and helping old ladies cross the street, but affirm God's right to be worshipped solely and so on. So it's not like an either or. It's if that makes sense. Anyway, he also suggests, he cites the ayah in Surah Al-Ma'idah. I'm citing the version from Surah Hud, so I can't. وَلَوْ شَاءَ رَبُّكَ لَجَعَلَ النَّاسَ أُمَّةً وَاحِدَةً. Is that the way it occurs in Surah Ma'idah? And so on. Anyway, but it's this kind of ethos. Now, it's almost suggested that it is and it is true. It's the divine will that all people do not follow the same religion and what have you. But I mean, now that's a very kind of interesting reading of the verse, because the Quran, of course, explains itself. And in my understanding, if you want to understand this verse correctly, you should refer to its Surah Hud, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. ولو شاء ربك لجعل الناس أمة واحدة ولا يزالون مختلفين
حتى
إلا من رحم ربك ولذلك خلقهم وتم كلمات ربك لأملأن جهنم من الجنة والناس أجمعين. Now, that's a very different take on the plurality of religions. Well, it's actually the same take, but the Quran is consistent in this respect. Now, and I think even independent of the tafsir tradition, it's very clear what's being said here. Religious plurality and difference, khilaf, is discussed, and it says that people will disagree, إِلَّا مَنْ رَحِمَ رَبُّكَ. So religious unity is a function of God's rahmah, very clearly in this verse, and divergence is also a product of God's will, but not a good thing, clearly. وَلِذَلِكَ خَلَقَهُمْ. And if you look at the tafsir of this part of the verse, Ibn Abbas, for instance, in Tabari is reported as saying things like, وَلِذَلِكَ خَلَقَهُمْ, i.e. he created some people to send to paradise and some people to send to the fire. Right. And then the fact that the same verse ends with this, وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ لَأَمْلَأَنَّ جَهَنَّمَ, and so on. Like, this is, I think, the message this verse sends on religious plurality. And let's not forget, the Quran is revealed in a sectarian milieu, and it is deeply aware of sectarian and religious difference and rivalry. The Quran says of the Christians, وَأَغْرَيْنَا بَيْنَهُمْ الْعَدَاوَةَ وَالْبَغْضَاءَ. Like the fact that sectarian Christian rivalry, and it's discussed at length in the tafsir tradition, is something the Quran reflects on. The fact that religious difference is not a good thing. And all of that's a kind of much more faithful reading of the verse if you understand the Quran in its sectarian milieu and read the Quran by understanding other verses and so on in context.
I mean, it's very interesting in some of Qaradawi's writings. I noticed this verse being cited. And I mean, he was just talking about, well, actually, pluralism is something which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has, and it's part of his mashia, so he has willed it.
Or as Ibn Taymiyyah would say, was irada kawniyya, not irada shar'iyya.
Right,
basically.
Right. So,
you find similar distinctions, even in Ibn Arabi apparently makes the same similar distinction.
Okay.
And it's interesting. I mean, this idea of cultivating humility through effacing hierarchy. I mean, I mentioned in I think maybe last episode, Gregory Lipton, in his book Rethinking Ibn Arabi, talks about how in Anatolia, Ibn Arabi, the Sufi, famous one, dies 1240, not Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi the Qadi.
Yeah.
Urges, like Ibn Taymiyyah, he urges local rulers to enforce the shurut Umariyya. I mean,
right.
And yet he is this kind of mystic, and all kinds of things have been claimed about his religious belief. But when it comes to the actual practice on the ground, and I'm sure he was concerned with cultivating humility and so on.
Yeah, I mean, Ibn Arabi is such a colourful figure, and I always find it challenging to talk about because
there's that great source. There's that great source book. I looked at it. I have a copy in London, unfortunately, on non-Muslims in kind of Muslim context. I forget the title. Christian Sana was one of the co-editors. I'm sure you know which volume I'm talking about. Can you look it up?
Right,
perhaps?
It's a relatively recent one.
Yeah, I think I was in Exeter when it came out, or maybe Edinburgh towards the end of my time in Edinburgh. Anyway, it's a source book. I mean, the kinds of complex dynamics between the followers of different religions, I mean, it really comes through in some of the sources. I mean, I remember, I forget who translated it. There's one which is basically a poem written by, I don't know if it's in Iberia, written by a Muslim to, perhaps it's a Jew or maybe a Christian, whose son had converted. And the poem is in some sense deeply ambivalent because he's mourning how his friend will feel and, all of the problems this will cause. And obviously at the same time, this person has joined the kind of saved community, and that's something to be celebrated. So, I mean, on the ground, these things are always complicated. I would definitely resist attempts to suggest that, I think it's a Rousseau who says, how can you live peaceably alongside somebody whom you believe is damned to hell and all this? I mean, that's nonsense. And Adam Geis's book on sectarianism that I've referred to numerous times in the last few episodes, which I reviewed for the SOAS Bulletin, really shows you this is nonsense. And, in the Ottoman context, I really think, and barring the Safavid wars, which are kind of politically have a political accent. If you look at relations within the Ottoman Empire between religions, I really think the worst episodes of sectarian violence were things like the 1860 Damascus riots. I don't think you had catastrophes of this scale, in the 17th and 16th century in Damascus and the Levant.
And that's in the context, remind me, I mean, this is in the context of kind of the implosion of the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, I mean, scholars have, I can think of scholars who've, the whole career is basically dedicated to this episode. But I mean, and an excellent...
going to publish a book about this very shortly.
Fantastic. I mean, there are actually, Brill has a volume. I really like Osama Makdisi's book on an ecumenical frame. I forget if that's the title, but this is a really good book, and he talks about it. This is a very good book to think with. I really enjoyed it. Some people argue it's about, as Geisser would thankfully remind us, these things are complex and have complex causes, and it's not just a simple case of, Druze and Christians don't like one another and therefore they have to kill each other. I mean, and in Qasim Zeman's book, which I also think I mentioned in that sectarian context. I mean, so sectarian violence in Pakistan really rocketed from the 1980s onwards. Yes, certainly it existed before, but these are complex sociological processes that are not monocausal. And, not that Dr. Youshaa suggests they are, of course, but, I think particular theological attitudes about the self-efficacy of Islam as a religion can exist alongside genuine amity. And the fact that that's true, I think, is evident to you and to me, and indeed to Dr. Youshaa. So that's not a criticism of his book, just something he kind of prompted me to think about more clearly.
Right. Jazakumullah khairan. I think we've actually crossed the 2-hour mark, so this is quite. It's one of our longest sessions, and so I think this is a tribute to how much the book has kind of inspired us to think about some very important questions, which are of crucial importance in our time. I mean, it's really nice that the subtitle says "From Early Islam to the Present," right? I mean, it's
and that's in the book. I mean, the thesis, as far as I remember, kind of stops with Ghazi,
which is kind of a wise thing to do in the sense of these traditions are just so vast. You can just end up doing the sort of thing that Michael Cook does and write a 700-page book when you set out to write a couple of 100 pages. So I'm thinking of commanding right, forbidding wrong. So Omar, Jazakumullah khairan. I guess first of all, Jazakumullah khairan to Dr. Youshaa Patel for writing really a thought-provoking book, which we'll be reading and reflecting on for years to come, and recommending to our colleagues to sort of set in their classrooms. And after that, Jazakumullah khairan, Omar, for reading through it so meticulously, sharing your thoughts. We are going to be on hiatus, I understand, for a period.
So perhaps I can say something about that. So,
Mashallah, Youshaa is doing us some sort of publicity. Love Islamic review, subscribe and watch. Mashallah.
Yes, evidently he received our check in the mail. I'm glad. So we're kind of collecting celebrity endorsements. So Dr. Youshaa is very valued. And I'm excited about his future work, and definitely watch that space. I'm kind of awaiting the release of a number of books. So publishers don't always send books to you in advance of publication. They often ask you to wait in March. And because of various commitments in March and Ramadan, I think we will probably resume after Ramadan. I will take notes on various books before then, inshallah, but it's our habit in this series of not broadcasting during Ramadan.
Just on the channel, I might have some discussions which are of a bit more maybe spiritual nature during Ramadan. I've
lots of exciting books coming out in the next few months, some of which I've already said we'll certainly do episodes on, inshallah. I mean, Cole Bunzel's is an obvious one. I'm very excited about. I think that comes out in mid-May. Ahmed Khan's book comes out, I think, in late March, so it will have been Ramadan. Ramadan will have started, and there are a number of others that come to mind. That we will do, of course, on the Twitter page for the channel. We'll keep you updated, inshallah. But until then, I hope people have a productive Ramadan. Thank you again to Dr. Youshaa for his wonderful book and his research. Very grateful for that.
Khairan, inshallah. So with that, I sort of ask for your prayers for us during the Ramadan break. And you can reach out to either one of us, of course, via email if you would like to. And inshallah, until after Ramadan, for the Islamicate book reviews to resume, we wish you all the best. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.